When you choose to host your SQL Server workload in Azure, you basically have two choices. You can either go with an Azure SQL database, which is going to be that hosted platform as a service solution, or you can take SQL Server and spin up a virtual machine and install SQL Server, or have a virtual machine image that has SQL Server on it, but then you're running SQL Server in Azure essentially the exact same way with the exact same load that you would have with an on-premises solution. So when we're looking at SQL Server running in a virtual machine on Azure versus an Azure SQL database, you're really looking at the same argument or the same discussion going Azure SQL database versus on-premises SQL Server. So let's talk about some of the differentiation. And it's not that one is always going to be better than the other. There are different use cases, different workloads where one solution is going to be a better fit for that workload than the other. So let's look at first of all, the Azure SQL database. It's going to be standardized, interoperable, and it's going to be a scalable managed database solution, right? The Azure SQL database is going to contain size limits. We looked at those in an earlier topic, right? Now you do have some limitations in terms of disk sizes, but really that can be combined with a virtual machine environment, so you don't see the same limitation there. All right. It is going to require potentially some re-architecting of existing applications. If you've got applications that use capabilities that are not available in the Azure SQL database and you want to switch over, then obviously you're going to need to re-architect that. Anything at the server level, things for, if you are installing custom extensions into a server to use that, obviously that's not going to work. But if you've got cloud-based applications, it is absolutely ideal for that. Okay, well, what about SQL Server in a virtual machine in Azure, which again is going to be really the same experience as on-premises, except you're not responsible for the hardware and you're also not responsible for the virtualization environment, right? It's going to give you, however, a very high level of compatibility with SQL Server in an on-premises environment. Even things like always-on availability groups, those capabilities are going to be available if you're using virtual machines in an Azure environment as well. Okay, so if you've got existing applications that require that the installation be customized, then it may only be possible to do that as a virtual machine. Okay, now of course it is going to require more maintenance and customization to achieve scalability, whereas scalability is built in to the concept, to the core of the Azure SQL database. Certainly SQL Server is scalable, but if you are a SQL Server person, you realize that with an on-premises environment, that's going to mean things like setting up various sharding techniques so that you have an elastic database perhaps, or doing things like always-on availability groups, replication, whatever it is you need to do to make sure that you scale properly. All of that, of course, is handled for you in the Azure SQL database. Now, a couple of other things that differentiate, okay, is the security settings. And this is pretty interesting. On the Azure SQL database side, there is a check mark, an option that says, okay, I want this SQL Server database, this Azure SQL database, to be available to all Azure services in this subscription. Right? And so that means that I don't have to have an additional layer of configuration to make sure that services that are cloud-based services hosted in the same subscription, those are going to have access by default to the database. While the database is still secure, it doesn't mean I have to open the database wide open. It just means that it's going to be available with a simple configuration option to any service that I'm running, which is pretty nice. Right? Also, though, if you need more specific, right, by default, the Azure SQL database, it doesn't allow external access. You have to grant external access to it. And you grant external access by granting IP address ranges. Right? So if you've got on-premises IP addresses that you want to be able to, say, use SQL Server Management Studio, then you would set those up. Right? Or maybe you've got an on-premises service that's still running and will be running on-premises, but you want it to pull data from your Azure SQL database. Well, you can configure that relatively easily as well. The story on the virtual machine is a little bit different. First of all, on the virtual machine, depending on which version of Azure you're running, if you're running virtual machines in the Service Manager, the version 1, then you're going to have to create endpoints that are going to allow communication. If you're running in your version 2 or your Azure Resource Manager model, then you're going to probably have to create potentially public endpoints and probably create network security groups to allow the right kind of access, the controlled access, into your SQL Server machine. Okay? In addition, of course, to any configuration within the virtual machine itself. Now, Azure services are treated as an external connection. Right? Now, the one exception to this is that you can configure your virtual network and you can have your services participate, depending on how they're configured, in that virtual network. And by default, if I've got a virtual network, unless I've got a network security group set up that disallows it, I have the ability within a virtual network for inter-machine communication. As long as they're in the same virtual network, then I don't have anything to worry about. So there's ways that I can configure that to make it easy, but it's a case-by-case basis. Whereas with an Azure SQL database, I simply go to that one checkbox and say, okay, any service I create in this subscription is going to have access to that Azure SQL database.